Hi, this is Brandon from ThirstGym.com. Today we're talking about exercise called the Sumo pin pull or the Sumo rack pull, whatever you really want to call it. Sumo deadlift off pins. Tons of different names you can really call this exercise. Basically, we're going to deadlift the bar off the pins. We're going to decrease the range of motion. This is really aimed at usually trying to improve your position or your lockout. Now, we have already made a conventional video on this in terms of the conventional stance. This is honestly the exact same exercise with just a sumo stance. But I'm going to cover some subtle differences of what you probably would see in a sumo versus a conventional, because I do think conventional people, when they do this, are definitely more apt to cheat on the exercise than sumo pullers, because you can't really scoop as much in a sumo. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. So we'll get some first things out of the way here, that a deadlift off the pins or a pin pull or a rack pull, whatever you want to call it, is not the same as a block pull. They have similar properties, yes, but there are big biomechanical differences, especially if you are a competitive strength athlete or power lifter. If you're getting close to a meet, my suggestion is to always use blocks or mats to pull off of, if at all possible. I think you'll find, one, it carries over better to your deadlift, but also the way the bar breaks off the mats will be exactly how it's going to break off the floor when you go to deadlift at the meet. That's not going to be the case with pins. So, as you can see, the pins are inside the weights, okay? So, because this is closer, it's not going to flex like it does with the regular deadlift bar on there. And it's also going to kind of break as a unit. So, if you also look at just the sheer amount of mass that is on the pin, it's much, much smaller. You know, this is a very small point on each side. Where if I was deadlifting off the floor, for example, and I had 500 pounds on here, I've got all this real estate on the ground that I've got to work to get to break off the floor. That is going to be a much slower break because of that, but the weight is more dispersed into one area, where here all the weight is dispersed into one small area. So as soon as it starts to break, it's going to go, okay? So just make sure you understand that. The mechanics of how it's going to change to your deadlift is going to be different. If you've got a really big issue with breaking the weight off the floor, this is probably not the exercise for you. You're definitely going to want to spend more time off the mats in particular. That way it mimics how it breaks, especially if you compete with a deadlift bar and it's got that big nasty whip on it and you got to pull that slack out. You don't get that with a regular power bar, and especially not out of the pins. So just keep that in mind. Now that I've got that covered, otherwise set your pins up a little bit below where you have issues if you're using this from a weak point standpoint. So you don't want to set it right at there. You want to focus on being able to drive and create force through your sticking point. But if you set it right at, by the time it breaks, you've already basically passed where you're having issues, right? So set it a little bit below. This particular rack that I'm using today for my demonstration purposes, didn't plan this out very well. This is definitely too high for me, okay? I never had issues at this point whenever I deadlifted. I'm honestly too short to probably use this rack from a pin pull perspective. I want to use the one next to me. But regardless, just make sure you can be able to put them where you want. But usually, you also want to make sure that you're not going to have it too high and it's just basically a glorified lockout position, okay? But from a sumo stance perspective, you're just going to basically take your normal stance, okay, and treat everything else the same. Again, this is really high for my demonstration purposes, but again, if I was going to be here, this is technically right around my kneecap. I really want it probably about 2 to 3 inches lower for me personally. But again, you're basically just going to treat it like your regular deadlift. Feet out, make sure you got good quality foot contact, knees are driven out, chest is tall, big breath, brace. Bring your hips forward, back down. As you can see, that's very lockout heavy, something that I definitely probably don't need for this particular exercise. Now, because of the way the exercise is, we talked about the scooping earlier. In conventional, people will usually try to like wedge themselves and try to like do one of these things. Okay, with sumo, especially when it's this high for me, you can't really get underneath it and scoop it because your knees are out, and even if you get here, you can't really like scoop underneath it. You can't do that as much with sumo, so you don't have to worry about that negative problem. However, but because of the pins, and again, we talked about not having all that real estate on the ground or on the mats, what you can find is that people will really lean back a lot more than what they can on a regular deadlift. So what you'll find is that if people are really struggling with a rep, they're going to like lean back this way and almost like try to like basically wedge their feet underneath the bar more than what they would if they were not pulling from the floor. So that's where I see the issue with sumo, is almost trying to like arc and like crane it, where conventional people will kind of like scoop it, if that makes sense. So make sure you're not doing that. But if you're not doing that, honestly, the technique for your sumo deadlift should all be the same. Now, when it comes to programming, just like with conventional, I think the best place this works is as like a 1 rep max, or if you're doing conjugate-based work, your max effort-based stuff, set right below your weak point, and you just pull a single. I don't think there's any really benefit from doing a ton of reps on an exercise like this. You're really trying to explode through there with heavy loads, and then you can definitely say, hey, my pin pull is way harder than my deadlift off the floor. Well, then you found an exercise that might be crucial to helping you maintain position, get through that weak point, and developing some strength in that weak area of the lift. Now, if you are going to use this as a supplemental-based exercise, so basically exercise after your deadlift, say you do your normal deadlift work from the floor, and you want to use this afterwards, then my suggestion is, again, put it where you need it, but make sure the weight stops each time between your reps. That way you're not bouncing them off the pins and doing any of that kind of nonsense. Really let it stop, let it absorb the energy and go again. And as I mentioned, the other one, I think clusters work great if you're going to do that. Or if you're going to work on the lockout position, kind of like how I am, again, get about 50 to 60%, nothing heavy. But again, you're just going to be here, lock it out, let it stop, barely let it stop, so that you can keep all that tension on your hips, and then you can work on that hip and lockout portion, almost kind of a mix between a deadlift and an RDL, and then you can use that as like a finisher, so to speak. Again, don't program that a whole lot. I have with good success for people who have lockout issues, but again, I think this works better as your main movement for the day. So if you got any questions about rack pull, pin pull, sumo deadlift off pins, whatever you want to call it, just please feel free to leave them in the comment section. Thanks. Have a great day.